Charleston, South Carolina, March 1859. If you want a clean beginning, you won't get it here. This story starts the way the country preferred its crimes. Behind polished doors, under chandeliers, inside rooms where black breath was counted as furniture and black silence was called loyalty. His name was Amos Booker, 27 years old, enslaved, assigned as a body servant to Senator Caldwell Vance. In the newspapers, Vance was a pillar. In drawing rooms, he was honorable. In private, he was a man who treated human beings as tools and then blamed the tools for being used. Amos lived within arm's reach of power. That is not a privilege. It is proximity to heat. He dressed the senator, poured his drinks, carried messages that were never meant for his eyes. He stood in the corners during dinners where men laughed about order while their money came from disorder inflicted on others. The nation loved to imagine enslaved men as deaf, dumb, grateful. It trained itself to believe that because a slave was not allowed to speak, a slave could not know. That belief is what killed people. That belief is what made conspirators careless. On an evening in March 1859, Amos heard a door that should have stayed shut. He heard voices that should have stayed cautious. He heard a plan that was not politics, not debate, not heated rhetoric. It was engineering, a timeline, a budget, the kind of language men use when they are no longer arguing about truth, only arranging outcomes. In a study off the main parlor, where the senator's guests retreated to cigars and certainty, Amos paused with a tray in his hands and the wrong kind of access in his ears. They spoke of unrest like it was a product to be delivered. They spoke of citizens who would be paid to appear spontaneous. They spoke of pamphlets to be printed in quantities too large for innocence. They spoke of meetings at docks and markets, of staged confrontations meant to draw blood and then draw headlines. They spoke of the real objective without naming it directly. If you can make the streets look ungovernable, you can sell the public any cure you choose. You can demand emergency powers. You can call opponents traitors. You can move a country towards civil war and claim you were dragged there by chaos you paid for. This was the architecture of provocation. Not a riot as accident, but a riot as instrument. The men in that room did not fear violence. They feared control slipping out of their hands. So they planned violence they could steer, violence with a signature that would point away from them. And Senator Caldwell Vance, Charleston's rising titan, Washington's darling, was at the center of it, calm as a banker, precise as an accountant. The moral rod of it wasn't hidden. It was discussed like strategy at a card table. Amos did not gasp. He did not burst in. Enslaved people survive by mastering the art of not looking surprised. He learned long ago that outrage is a luxury granted to the protected. He kept his face blank. He delivered the tray. He left. He carried the words out with him like contraband, knowing already that the truth can be more dangerous than any lie. Then there was the second reality in that house, the kind that pretends it is separate from politics. Evelyn Vance, 19 years old, the senator's daughter. Her gentleness was the gentleness of someone who had never been powerless. She could smile and make servants move. She could lower her voice and make men bend closer. She spoke to Amos as though his existence was a private arrangement, not a public crime. She did not call it ownership when she meant ownership. She called it care. She called it attachment. She called it love, and expected gratitude in return. She believed Amos belonged to her in a way the law would recognize without any need for her to say it aloud. Her affection was real in the way a child's affection for a pet is real. Warm, possessive, unquestioning. She was capable of tenderness, yes. She was also capable of treating another human being as a keepsake. The country raised her to confuse control with devotion, and because her father was Senator Caldwell Vance, her confusion was protected by money, by status, by the same system that made Amos's pain invisible. The dangerous thing about Evelyn was not that she hated him, it was that she didn't have to. The system doesn't require hatred to do its work, it only requires entitlement. She could stroke his hand in a hallway and ruin him in a sentence and never see the contradiction. She could whisper that she trusted him while her father's friends discussed turning cities into tinder. That is the American split, private softness laid over public brutality, like lace over a wound. After March 1859, Amos carried two secrets at once. One was the senator's blueprint for inciting unrest. The other was that the senator's daughter believed her feelings gave her rights. Both secrets were dangerous. One could burn a nation. The other could cage a man forever. He tried to think like someone the world had never allowed him to be. a witness. Not a servant, not a shadow, an observer with memory. But memory is not harmless. In a country built to deny black testimony, to discard black names, to rewrite black lives as property records, a witness is a threat by definition. Amos understood that if he spoke, he would not be treated as a citizen revealing treason. He would be treated as a slave committing insolence. He would be punished not for being wrong, but for daring to be right. That is why men like Caldwell Vance planned their crimes in rooms where enslaved people served them. They believed the enslaved could not become accusers. They believed the law would never accept their words as evidence. And they were correct often enough to keep believing it. But there are moments when a person realizes the cost of silence is no longer survivable. Amos reached that edge in March 1859. If this plan matured, if it succeeded, people would die who never agreed to be sacrificed for a senator's ambition. Not only black bodies, though black bodies would always be first. White bodies, too, poor bodies, immigrant bodies, anyone useful as a headline. Disorder would be manufactured, then punished. Violence would be staged, then sanctified. The nation would be driven toward war and told it was fate. Amos did not have the luxury of idealism. He had the clarity of someone who had watched power lie for years and had never once been invited to the table where truth was negotiated. He understood something that respectable Americans still pretend not to understand. Civil collapse is often not an accident. It is often a project. It is made by men who profit from fear. He also understood that he was already trapped inside the enemy's household. The senator's study, the senator's dinners, the senator's guests. This was the artery. And Evelyn was the hand around the throat. She watched him too closely now, as if she sensed the shift in his posture, the faint refusal forming in his silence. Her kindness sharpened into something needier. She wanted reassurance. She wanted ownership confirmed. She wanted him to be what the house demanded, compliant, grateful, fixed in place. There is a moral instruction here, and it is not gentle. When an enslaved man hears a conspiracy, the burden does not sit on the conspirators first, it sits on him. The nation will ask what he did, whether he misunderstood, whether he exaggerated, whether he deserved what happened next. That is how America launders guilt, by putting the responsibility for stopping evil onto the people it has already stripped of rights. So mark the beginning clearly. March 1859, Charleston. Amos Booker overhears Senator Caldwell Vance laying out a plan to provoke riots, manufactured unrest meant to push the country towards civil war. And the same night, within the same house, the senator's daughter Evelyn treats Amos as a possession dressed up as romance. That is the cage, politics outside, intimacy inside, both enforcing the same hierarchy. Amos is not only up against a senator's scheme, he is up against a nation's habit of erasing black agency, first by enslavement, then by disbelief, and finally by punishment. If you're listening from somewhere, anywhere, comment where you're from. And subscribe, because the next step Amos takes is the one America was built to make impossible. He tries to turn knowledge into testimony. Washington City, May 1859. The nation called it a capitol. Amos learned quickly it was a vault, marble on the outside, ledgers on the inside, and human lives tallied like expenses. Senator Caldwell Vance arrived as if the streets belonged to him, carriage wheels loud, servants silent, introductions exchanged in warm tones that hid cold intentions. Amos came with the luggage and with the senator's secrets lodged behind his teeth. In Charleston, the plan had sounded like a private vice. In Washington, it revealed itself as a professional craft. There is a particular cruelty in how power travels. It drags its comforts with it and leaves its victims to adapt. Amos did not get a new life in the Capitol. He got a new set of rooms to be invisible in. He slept in the servant quarters and woke before dawn to dress the senator, polish boots, prepare papers, and stand a step behind at every threshold. His hands were required everywhere. His name was required nowhere. That was the first mechanism of control. Proximity without recognition, labor without identity. By mid-May 1859, Caldwell's schedule turned into a drumbeat. Breakfast meetings, committee corridors, private dinners, backroom conversations where men used the language of duty while negotiating the price of disorder. Amos watched the senator's face in these moments, steady, almost serene. Because he was not improvising, he was implementing. That distinction matters. A reckless man can be stopped by his own mistakes. A methodical man stops only when he is forced, and he uses institutions as armor. Amos began hearing the same terms repeated across different mouths, like a hymn the faithful all knew. Committees, public sentiment, security, patriotism. Beneath the respectable words, the same ugly intent hardened. They spoke of citizens' associations forming in port cities, of volunteers prepared to defend property, of men who could stir the dock workers or turn the market crowds. These were not spontaneous movements. These were purchases. The conspirators understood something the public often refuses to accept. Crowds can be hired, and outrage can be staged, and once violence is visible, the audience begs for the author of that violence to become the savior. The plan was being written into existence with logistics. Amos heard about cash set aside for printing, pamphlets with identical phrases meant to look grassroots, as if the people had spoken with one voice by coincidence. He heard about lists, names of men who could be relied upon to start a fight and then swear it was self-defense. He heard dates referenced casually, as if time itself belonged to the senator, not someday, not if necessary, but before the month is out, by the next shipment, when Congress breaks for recess. The political trick was crude in principle and sophisticated in execution. Provoke unrest, provoke retaliation, then point at the wreckage as proof that your enemies are dangerous. Manufacture fear, then sell authority as the cure. It is an old recipe, and it does not require genius, only reach, money, and a public trained to confuse force with safety. Caldwell had all three. Amos did what the enslaved have always done when they are forced into the role of witness. He began collecting fragments, not because he believed paper would save him, but because memory alone can be denied. A torn corner of a note, a phrase repeated verbatim across different letters, a name overheard and matched to a face. He didn't have the luxury of taking documents openly. His hands would be punished for touching what his eyes were never meant to read. So he gathered the residue. The crumbs power drops when it believes no one lower can assemble the loaf. One afternoon in May 1859, he saw a memo on the senator's desk, half covered by a blotter. Amos could not read it the way a free clerk would, seated comfortably with permission. He read it the way the enslaved read, standing, moving, pretending not to see while capturing what he could. A date, a location, a short list of names with marks beside them. He did not take the paper. Taking would be proof of theft. He took the details instead, storing them in the only place Caldwell could not search without admitting fear, Amos's mind. But then the second trap tightened. Evelyn Vance arrived in Washington that season with the bright, curated innocence of a young woman who had never been asked what she cost others. She moved through parlors and gardens like a blessing, and people responded accordingly. She brought the scent of home into Caldwell's rented house and, with it, the private rules that mattered more than law. Her attention to Amos increased, not out of suspicion alone, but out of entitlement. She felt him changing. She felt his silence turning from obedience into restraint. And because she believed he belonged to her, any distance looked like betrayal. Her affection was not a release from cruelty. It was cruelty's softer uniform. She found reasons to summon him, an errand that could have been done by anyone, a book carried to her room, a glass of water delivered even when another servant stood closer. These were tests. Each time Amos complied, she took it as proof of possession. Each time he hesitated, she took it as disloyalty. She spoke to him in a low voice, gentle enough to sound like care, sharp enough to sound like warning. She reminded him, without naming it, that she could shield him. The implication was always the same. Outside her favor, there was exposure, and exposure was death, or worse, disappearance. Evelyn did not need to threaten him with whips. The system had already built the threat into every wall. In Washington City, there were slave pens within reach of the Capitol's shadow. There were patrols that asked questions enslaved men were not allowed to answer. There were laws that treated black movement as suspicion by definition. Evelyn's love existed inside that machinery. It drew its power from it. She was not separate from her father's politics. She was its domestic extension. Amos tried to move carefully, but careful is not safe when the enemy owns the floor under your feet. The more he learned, the more he understood the Riot plan was not merely about forcing civil conflict abstractly. It was about shaping public perception so that when violence erupted, violence Caldwell intended to trigger, Caldwell could present himself as necessary. Necessary to restore order, necessary to punish agitators, necessary to protect the nation, necessary, in other words, to climb. He began to see how such a plan could travel across states. Violence in one city becomes justification in another. A dock brawl becomes a newspaper headline. A headline becomes a speech becomes a law becomes handcuffs. And the handcuffs rarely find the hands that wrote the first check. They find the hands that are easiest to seize, the poor, the foreign, the black, the ones whose existence is treated as a problem to be managed. By late May 1859, Amos recognized something else. The conspiracy depended on plausible deniability, not secrecy. Caldwell did not need the plan to remain unknown to everyone. He only needed it to remain unprovable. He only needed anyone who could testify to be discredited, silenced, or erased. That is where Amos's position became fatal. An enslaved man's testimony was already considered suspect. If Amos spoke, they would not debate him. They would reduce him to an object and then destroy the object for malfunctioning. Amos weighed options the way a trapped man weighs walls. He could run, without papers, without a name that would hold. He could stay silent, while the country marched toward violence designed by men in clean coats. Or he could attempt the unthinkable, become a whistleblower in a nation that did not recognize him as a person. This is the moral pressure point, and it is not romantic, it is prosecutorial. If you understand what is coming and you say nothing, you become part of the machinery, even if the machine has your neck under its gears. So Amos kept listening, he kept assembling. He kept counting dates. Washington City in May 1859 was not merely where politics happened, it was where disorder was commissioned, like a building contract, and inside that contract was a hidden clause. Anyone who reveals the terms will be treated not as a protector of the nation, but as an enemy of it. Remember that. Because the next stage is not the riot itself. The next stage is what always comes first when power senses exposure. It selects a target. It decides whose life can be erased to preserve its story. Amos Booker, enslaved and unnamed in the ledgers that matter, was the perfect candidate. Richmond, Virginia, August 1859. By then, Amos Booker no longer needed to guess what Senator Caldwell Vance was doing. The plan had matured from talk into infrastructure. It had weight, it had roots. It had people who acted as if they were already protected by the future they were trying to force into existence. And Amos, enslaved, 27, kept close enough to hear everything and far enough to matter to no one, understood the real danger. Once a conspiracy becomes a system, it doesn't just commit crimes, it manufactures innocence for the men in charge and guilt for whoever stands in the way. Caldwell relocated briefly through Virginia that summer under the cover of constituent work, a phrase that sounds harmless until you learn what it hides. In Richmond, his meetings were smaller, more controlled, less theatrical than Washington dinners. He wasn't rallying crowds here. He was confirming supply lines, printers, money, trusted intermediaries, men who didn't need speeches, only instructions. Amos watched Caldwell's demeanor sharpen. In Washington, he performed statesmanship. In Richmond, he performed command. The core design became explicit. Caldwell did not want random unrest. Random unrest is messy and can turn against you. He wanted a specific kind of violence, violence that could be blamed on the other side, violence that could be photographed in the public imagination, violence that could justify escalation. He needed a sequence: incite a confrontation, provoke retaliation, frame the retaliation as barbarism, then demand order. And in that demand, he would expand the powers of the men already holding the whip. Amos reached the moment where listening alone became complicity. It wasn't idealism that moved him. It was the kind of cold moral arithmetic that enslaved people have always been forced to do. If I stay silent, others die. If I speak, I might die first. The nation likes to praise courage when it costs nothing. This was courage that would cost a life, possibly not only his, but the lives of anyone who dared to say they heard him. So Amos attempted the lawful route first, because the law is the altar America forces you to kneel before even when it spits in your face. In early August 1859, he arranged a contact with a low-level government clerk he had noticed near the Capitol offices months earlier, Deputy Clerk Thomas R. Hale. Remember the name? Because it matters how small men become instruments for large crimes. Hale was not a senator, he was not a general. He was a functionary with ink-stained fingers and a conscience he liked to display in safe conversations. He had once muttered to a colleague that the extremists were ruining the country. Amos stored that mutter like a key. He approached Hale not as an equal. America did not permit that fiction. but as a careful witness offering information. He chose his words with surgical restraint, not grand accusations, not emotional appeals. Dates, locations, the pattern of hired agitation, references to printed pamphlets and citizens' committees that were anything but citizen-led. The senator's name was the most dangerous element, and Amos did not say it first. He made Hale arrive at it. He let the clerk connect the dots because people protect what they believe they discovered on their own. Hale listened. Hale went pale. Hale said the expected things. "This is serious. You did right coming to me. We must be careful." He promised discretion. He promised he would look into it. He offered the comforting illusion that institutions respond to truth. Amos wanted to believe him, not because he was naive, but because belief is sometimes the only fuel left when every other option leads to a cliff. And then the machine turned. 2 days later, mid-August 1859, Amos noticed he was being watched, not by the casual surveillance enslaved people endure daily, the ordinary gaze that measures you like livestock. This was different. This was targeted. Men with no purpose suddenly had purpose when Amos entered a street. A carriage paused too long. A pair of boots followed at a consistent distance, never close enough to confront, never far enough to lose. These were not drunks, not thieves, not moral vigilantes. These were men doing paid work. That is the first lesson of political crime. The cover-up begins before the crime is complete. Caldwell's network did not wait to see if Amos would be believed. The network moved as if belief didn't matter. It moved to prevent testimony from ever becoming legible. It moved to isolate the witness from any ally who might validate him, and a black enslaved witness was easy to isolate because his existence was already socially solitary. The world had been trained not to stand beside him. Hale disappeared from Amos's reach. He stopped appearing in the places Amos had seen him. When Amos attempted to pass a second message through a runner, it came back unanswered. Silence can be the loudest confession. Either Hale had panicked and betrayed him, or Hale had been warned, threatened, absorbed into the senator's perimeter like debris pulled into a current. It hardly mattered which. The result was the same. The institution Amos appealed to had become a closed door with his fingerprints on the handle. Now layer in the second danger, Evelyn Vance. Evelyn sensed the shift not because she understood politics, but because she understood possession. In Richmond, away from the social theater of Washington, she watched Amos more closely. She intercepted him in corridors. She asked questions too soft to sound like interrogation. "Are you well? You seem distant. Is something troubling you?" In another world, those questions might have been kindness. In this one, they were a net. She offered him privacy the way a jailer offers a softer cell. She spoke of loyalty and trust, but what she wanted was submission restored. Her father's household had rules, and Amos's newfound stillness violated them. She did not know the details of what he'd overheard, but she knew he was holding something back, and she treated that withholding as an offense against her. Then she revealed her true position without raising her voice. She told him, gently, almost tenderly, that her father had enemies everywhere and that loose talk could get people hurt. She said she worried for him. She said she could protect him if he told her what was wrong. And when Amos didn't yield, her gentleness tightened into ownership. She reminded him, in the language of the era, that he was safe only inside the Vance orbit. She didn't need to mention whips. She didn't need to mention chains. The whole country was the threat. She was merely pointing at it. This is how complicity reproduces itself. A daughter raised by a powerful man believes protection is a gift she can grant while keeping the cage locked. She believes, "I love you," can coexist with, "You belong to us." She does not see the bloodstains because the carpet is expensive. Amos understood then that he was trapped between two forces that worked together even when they pretended to be separate. Caldwell represented public power, law, order, politics, conspiracy. Evelyn represented private power, affection, leverage, intimate surveillance. The senator could destroy him with institutions. The daughter could destroy him with a whisper. And both could call the destruction necessary. By late August 1859, the full shape of Caldwell's plan pressed into view like an image developing in dark fluid. The riots were not the end goal, they were the ignition. Caldwell wanted to provoke violence that could be narrated as a moral emergency. He wanted the nation to beg for harsher measures. He wanted opposition crushed under the pretext of unity. And he wanted, above all, deniability, a story where he was reacting, not acting. So he began cleaning the perimeter. The men following Amos were not there to arrest him, yet. Arrests create paperwork. Paperwork creates questions. Caldwell's first move was quieter: intimidation, isolation, pre-erasure. Make the witness feel hunted, make him doubt allies, make him desperate enough to run, and then label the running as guilt. Amos tried to keep his face composed. But the body carries terror even when the mouth does not. He slept lightly, waking at small sounds. He avoided certain streets. He learned which corners were safe and which were traps. He watched doors the way prisoners watch keys. And he realized, with a clarity that deserves to be recorded, that in America a slave who tells the truth becomes the criminal, not because the truth is false, but because it disrupts the hierarchy that requires lies to survive. Here is the moral record. August 1859 is when Amos attempted to bring evidence to a lawful channel, and the lawful channel either failed him or turned on him. August 1859 is when Senator Caldwell Vance's network began to shadow him, not with open violence but with strategic pressure. August 1859 is when Evelyn Vance tightened her claim, blending tenderness with threat, insisting Amos's safest condition was obedience. And August 1859 is when Amos understood the real nature of his enemy, not one man, but an ecosystem, family, institution, custom, and money, designed to ensure that black testimony never becomes history. The country teaches you to forget men like Amos. It teaches you to call them unreliable, hysterical, ungrateful, dangerous, but you don't have to love him to admit what happened. You only have to refuse the nation's favorite sin: deliberate amnesia. New York City, November 1859. By then, the punishment was no longer a rumor stalking Amos Booker from behind. It had hands, it had paperwork. It had the calm efficiency of men who understood that in America, you don't always have to kill a black witness. You can simply make him impossible to prove. Amos did not wake up that month and decide to flee. He was pushed into flight by a sequence of choices made by Senator Caldwell Vance and the network that served him. First came the tightening surveillance in August. Then came the social isolation in September. Doors that used to open for errands now closing, familiar servants avoiding his gaze, messages not delivered. And by October 1859, the air around Amos had changed into something institutional, the sense that a decision had been made about him, and that decision no longer required his participation. This is where the story turns from conspiracy to procedure. Caldwell's genius was not in making riots. It was in understanding that the state is a filing cabinet. If you control the folders, you control the reality. So the next move was not a beating in an alley. The next move was administrative homicide. In early November 1859, Amos was seized at dawn under the pretext of transfer. No court, no hearing. No accusations read aloud. Enslaved people did not receive explanations. They received orders. A pair of men arrived with a note bearing a familiar seal. The note did not need to be lawful. It only needed to look like it belonged to someone who could punish anyone who questioned it. Amos was told he was being moved for service elsewhere, language so bland it could hide any cruelty behind it. He was taken through routes chosen to avoid witnesses. Not the main streets where abolitionist sympathizers might notice. Not the familiar corners where other servants could later testify, "I saw him." This was deliberate, because when you plan to erase a person, you start by erasing their trail. The next stop was not a jail with a register. It was a private holding space, the kind that existed in plain sight in northern cities, while respectable citizens pretended it was a southern problem. Amos was kept in a room that smelled of damp wood and old fear. He heard other bodies. He heard chains shift. He heard the soft, disciplined movements of men who did this regularly, men who treated capture like a trade. Then the paper began to multiply. A document was produced claiming Amos Booker had been sold months earlier. Another claimed he had been transferred to a different household under a different name. A third suggested he had taken ill during travel and died, no body required because the enslaved were not granted the dignity of remains that needed accounting. These contradictions did not worry Caldwell's people. They weren't trying to tell one coherent story. They were trying to create enough noise that no single truth could survive. This is a particular American technique. Overwhelm the record, flood the system with versions until the victim becomes a question mark. Then call the question mark uncertain and move on. Amos learned the brutal mathematics of it. If he escaped physical captivity, he would still be trapped in a legal void. A black man without papers in 1859 could be seized as a runaway anywhere, especially when powerful interests wanted him seized. His body could be claimed by any white man willing to point and say, "That's mine." And Caldwell, with a senator's reach, could turn that risk into certainty. By mid-November 1859, Amos was transported again, this time to New York City, because New York was not only a place of commerce, it was a place of plausible deniability. It was a city where the public face of progress could coexist with the private economy of human capture. Here, the senator's network could bury Amos in the crowd, then retrieve him at will, like an object stored in a warehouse. He arrived without a name that held. The men escorting him called him by nothing at all, because names create witnesses, and witnesses create problems. In New York, Amos was kept moving, docks, alleys, cramped rooms above shops, always just long enough to prevent familiarity, never long enough for anyone to say later, "He stayed here. He existed here." That was the point. Existence requires trace. Caldwell's method was elegant in its cruelty. He did not have to publicly accuse Amos of lying about the riot plan. He did not have to argue with the facts. He only had to ensure Amos could not stand in any recognized place and say them. If Amos was a ghost in the records, then his testimony could be treated as fantasy, and if anyone tried to help him, that person could be accused of aiding a runaway, an offense punished harshly enough to chill even sympathetic hearts. This is where you should notice the deeper indictment. The erasure was not a single act. It was a collaboration between social custom and legal structure. It worked because the nation already assumed an enslaved man had no stable identity. It worked because black personhood was conditional, revocable, dependent on white acknowledgement. Caldwell merely used the existing design at a higher level, like a man who finds a loaded gun and calls it policy. At some point in late November 1859, Amos understood that the most dangerous weapon aimed at him was not iron, but ambiguity. If the record could be made inconsistent enough, he could be anything in the eyes of authorities. A runaway, a thief, a vagrant, a man impersonating a slave impersonating a free man. The state didn't need truth. It needed a category that justified control, and Caldwell's people could supply categories endlessly. So Amos began to do something that feels like madness until you understand survival. He started to plan his own disappearance on his terms. Not suicide, not surrender. Disappearance as a tactic. If the nation wanted him erased, he would choose where the erasure happened and how it could be used against his hunters. He looked for cracks in the network. Paid men drink. Paid men get careless. Paid men talk to impress women in taverns or to boast to other men. Amos listened the way he always had, quietly, hungrily, for any fragment that could help him map the perimeter. He learned which escort was impatient, which one liked to gamble, which one hated the cold. He learned what time they changed shifts. He learned how long the locks stayed unattended during delivery hours. He learned the routes toward crowds, because crowds are dangerous but also protective. In a crowd, a man becomes harder to single out, and he learned the final ugly truth. Caldwell did not need Amos dead. Amos dead could become a martyr if anyone ever found the body. Caldwell needed Amos unprovable. Amos needed to become the kind of missing that no one searches for. That was the senator's perfect solution, a man alive but unaccounted for, breathing but socially non-existent. The psychological violence of that cannot be overstated. A person can endure hunger and still retain the knowledge of self. But when the world insists you are not real, when every door demands a paper you cannot produce, when every question becomes a trap, you begin to feel your own identity peeling away. That is what erasure means in practice. It is not only being hidden from others, it is being pressured to doubt your own right to appear. By the end of November 1859, Amos Booker was in New York City with no recognized papers, no lawful name, and no institution willing to admit he was there. Senator Caldwell Vance's plot to incite riots had gained a new line item: the systematic deletion of the one enslaved man who had overheard too much. This was not a side effect. It was the central protection for the conspiracy, because a riot plan without a witness is only political talk. A riot plan with a witness becomes a crime. Remember the dates. Remember the mechanism. November 1859 is when the state's cruelty changed form, from physical domination to bureaucratic annihilation. It is when Amos became what America has always been skilled at manufacturing: a person the nation claims it cannot find because it never wanted to see him in the first place. Philadelphia, January 1860. This is the month the story stops pretending it is only about one senator and one enslaved man. This is the month you see how a whole class survives, by letting violence happen quietly, by calling it unfortunate, by keeping their hands clean while their paperwork does the choking. Amos Booker arrived in Philadelphia not as a fugitive with a destination, but as a breathing contradiction. In November 1859, Senator Caldwell Vance's network had turned him into a legal ghost. No stable name, no recognized past, no record that could protect him from being claimed, seized, or traded like a misplaced crate. By December, Amos understood he could not simply go public. There was no public for him. There were only doors guarded by men who would demand proof of personhood, and the proof had been stolen from him on purpose. In early January 1860, Amos found the one kind of refuge America hated precisely because it worked, a private network of conscience. Not the government, not the courts. Ordinary people in small communities, often religious dissenters, who made their homes into informal borders against the state's appetite. He reached a boarding house on the edge of the city run by Martha Klein, a Quaker widow with controlled eyes and a voice that did not waste words. Remember her name. In these stories, the powerful get monuments, the protectors get silence. That is backwards, and it is part of the crime. Martha did not ask Amos for a romantic explanation. She asked for facts, who was hunting him, what he had heard, what he could prove. She understood that morality without precision becomes a story, and stories are easy to dismiss. Amos told her enough to establish the danger without lighting her house on fire. He spoke of Senator Caldwell Vance. He spoke of the Riot plan forming in 1859 like a disease with a timetable. He spoke of hired agitators, printed pamphlets, staged street clashes meant to trigger retaliation and justify emergency power. He spoke of how he had tried a lawful channel in August and how the response had been surveillance and erasure. He spoke of the papers that contradicted each other, sold, transferred, dead, because the point wasn't truth. The point was confusion. Martha believed him the way people believe a man with nothing to gain by lying. She also understood what belief would cost. Harboring a man like Amos was not charity. It was an act of defiance against the machinery that fed on him. She took him in anyway because some people still recognized a basic principle the country kept trying to bury. If the law requires you to abandon the innocent, then the law is the criminal. But Amos did not come to Philadelphia only to hide. He came to reach Evelyn Vance. That fact is not sentimental. It is strategic and tragic at the same time. Evelyn was the senator's daughter, 19 years old, raised inside a fortress of privilege. She was also the only person in Caldwell's orbit who could alter the record from the inside without being instantly suspected. She had access to letters, seals, servants, and the private files a household kept, ledger entries, travel notes, names of drivers, quiet payments. She could delete traces. She could create misdirection. She could do what Amos could no longer do, move through the world without being asked to prove he existed. So Amos wrote to her, not a love letter. A controlled message delivered through Martha's contacts. It contained no poetry. It contained a location and a date. It contained one line that mattered most. Your father is not reacting to unrest, he is manufacturing it. And another line that cut deeper. You are not protecting me, you are part of the cage. Evelyn arrived in Philadelphia in January 1860 under the cover of visiting acquaintances. That cover was plausible because her class was always moving, travel framed as refinement, not escape. She came alone, no uniformed escort, no obvious guard. That alone tells you she already understood something she had been refusing to name. If her father suspected she might waver, he would not have allowed her to breathe unsupervised. When she entered Martha Klein's boarding house, Evelyn looked smaller than Amos remembered. Not fragile. Privilege rarely makes people fragile, but confronted. Her eyes carried the first real consequence of adulthood, the realization that her father's power was not merely a background comfort. It was a weapon. Amos did not greet her with tenderness. He did not beg. Begging is what the enslaved are trained to do. Amos was done performing gratitude. He laid out the facts like an indictment. March 1859. He overheard the plan. May 1859. He heard it formalized in Washington. August 1859. He attempted to warn a clerk and the machine turned on him. November 1859. He was administratively erased, moved without record, made unprovable. These were not misunderstandings. They were steps in a single design: provoke violence, then erase the witness. Evelyn listened with her hands clenched. She tried to defend her father the way children defend a god, by insisting complexity, by pleading that politics is messy, by claiming he had enemies who would say anything. Amos didn't argue with her feelings. He argued with the timeline. He told her the plan was discussed before the unrest. The budget existed before the public outrage. The hired men were named before the spontaneous clashes. The violence was not evidence of necessity. It was the product being sold. And then Amos said the thing that forced the choice into the open. Your father has decided I do not exist. That means he will do the same to anyone who stands with me, including you, if you become inconvenient. Evelyn's face changed, not because she suddenly became righteous, but because she recognized the truth her class understands better than anyone else. Power does not love you. Power uses you. She had believed her father's protection was permanent. She had believed her family's name was a shield that would never turn inward. Amos showed her the blade already pointed at him, and she saw, for the first time, that the hand holding it belonged to the man who kissed her forehead at night. This is where the story must hold her accountable. Evelyn had called Amos mine with a soft voice. She had wrapped ownership in affection. She had used intimacy as leverage, insisting he was safest inside her claim. That was not innocence. That was participation. It wasn't the same participation as Caldwell's. She didn't draft Riot budgets. But it was the domestic version of the same hierarchy. The belief that a black man's life could be arranged around her comfort. Now the choice arrived with its full cost. Save Amos and betray her father, or protect her father and finish the erasure. In January 1860, Evelyn chose to save Amos. Not purely out of love. Love in such a system is rarely pure, but out of something sharper, fear of what she had been helping to maintain, and terror of what her father was willing to do. She didn't cry and declare herself changed. She began to plan. That's the difference between sentimental redemption and real risk. Real risk looks like logistics. She told Amos she could remove traces. She could alter household records so that any pursuit would chase a shadow. She could redirect suspicion onto a false route, suggesting he'd been shipped south again, or died, or fled west. She could pay a driver who wouldn't ask questions. She could supply a forged travel note that would withstand casual scrutiny long enough to pass him through checkpoints. She could do it because she was a Vance. Doors open for her. That is the confession built into her solution. The only reason she could rescue him was the same reason he had been doomed. But Evelyn demanded a price, and it revealed her last cruelty. She said if she erased his trail, he must erase her from his future. No letters, no searching, no whispered name to anyone who might repeat it. Not because she wanted him free from a dangerous attachment, because she wanted herself safe from consequences. If Amos carried her name, he carried a thread back to Caldwell. If Amos remembered her publicly, she would have to live with what she did in a way her class was not trained to endure. So she offered him freedom with conditions. That is the pattern she could not fully escape. Even in rescue, she tried to control the terms. She still wanted to define the relationship, who owed what, who could speak, who must disappear. In another moral universe, Amos might have rejected that demand as another form of ownership. In this one, he recognized the grim reality. Survival would require cutting every thread, including the one tied to his heart. They reached a blunt agreement, the kind made under threat rather than romance. Evelyn would delete the trail. Amos would delete her. This is not a love story. It is a record of what a corrupt nation does to human attachment. It turns intimacy into leverage. It turns rescue into negotiation. It forces people to barter with their own memories. Remember January 1860 for what it represents. It is the month the senator's daughter finally sees the Riot plan as more than politics. It is the month she chooses to interfere, not by confronting her father publicly, because that would be suicide, but by sabotaging the evidence chain quietly. And it is the month Amos Booker learns the final doctrine of survival in a country built to erase him. Sometimes the only way to keep living is to become unreachable, even to the person you once thought you loved. April 1860, Baltimore first, then the roads that don't advertise where they lead. This is the last month in the file where Amos Booker is still permitted to be a person in his own mind. After this, he survives by cooperating with the nation's lie, by becoming the kind of absence America can tolerate, a black man who cannot be located, cannot be summoned, cannot be quoted, cannot be entered into any ledger except as unknown. Evelyn Vance executed the rescue the only way her world knows how to do anything, quietly, efficiently, with enough distance that she could deny it later. There was no public break with her father, no dramatic denunciation, because that would have triggered the full weight of Senator Caldwell Vance's machine. The senator did not need to prove wrongdoing. He only needed to say the word hysteria, or rebellion, or abduction, and the same society that applauded him would have locked his daughter away and hunted Amos harder. So Evelyn did what the privileged do when they are scared. She used private channels, private money, private paper. The plan was simple in outline and brutal in implication: a forged travel note with a believable seal, a ledger entry adjusted in the Vance household accounts that placed Amos somewhere else, somewhere dead or sold or shipped, a paid driver whose loyalty was purchased with cash and reinforced with fear, and the most important ingredient, time. If Amos could move fast enough in April 1860, he could cross beyond the senator's easiest reach before the questions caught up. Amos did not romanticize the escape. He treated it like surgery without anesthesia, necessary, painful, precise. He understood that every step of movement created risk. In Baltimore, black men could be seized on suspicion alone. In every town on the route, a white man could claim him as a runaway and force him into custody until ownership was determined. Ownership in those systems was not determined by truth. It was determined by power, and Caldwell had more power than any stranger Amos could meet. So Amos traveled under the worst kind of protection, plausible paperwork that could fail at any moment. A forged pass is not freedom. It is a temporary postponement of capture. It buys you minutes at a checkpoint, not dignity. He kept his eyes low, his speech minimal. He learned the posture of a man who must appear unremarkable to survive. That posture is its own violence. It trains you to shrink your presence until you almost disappear. Baltimore in April 1860 was crowded and suspicious. The streets carried the scent of port labor and political tension. The country was already cracking. You could feel it in the way men talked, in the way newspapers were carried like weapons, in the way strangers sized each other up. Caldwell's Riot plan, first overheard in March 1859, didn't need to be fully executed to poison the air. The rhetoric alone had already taught people to see enemies everywhere, and in that climate, a black man moving with uncertain papers was automatically framed as a threat. Amos moved anyway, not because he believed in destiny, but because staying meant certain erasure. He understood the calculus Evelyn had forced upon him. The only life available was a life without trace. No stable address, no community that could be raided and punished for sheltering him, no letters, no lingering. He had to become what the senator's machine could not easily seize, a moving target that never stayed long enough to be pinned to a page. Evelyn had provided what she could: money hidden in a seam, directions in coded phrases, the name of one contact that could be used exactly once. She had also delivered the final instruction, the one that cut deeper than any threat. Never speak her name again, never write it, never allow anyone to guess the thread between them. If that thread was discovered, Caldwell would not only reclaim Amos, he would punish anyone who helped him, and he would reassert control over Evelyn by turning her rescue into scandal. This was not love speaking, this was containment. Even in the act of saving him, Evelyn protected herself, her family, her future, and Amos agreed. Because in April 1860, moral purity was not on offer, only survival was. The most obscene part of the agreement is what it reveals about America's design. The enslaved man had to erase his own love to remain alive. Think about what that means. The country had already stolen his labor, his autonomy, his legal identity. Now it demanded his memory. It demanded his heart be amputated so the system could remain unembarrassed. He traveled with that amputation as an invisible wound. Each mile away from Baltimore was also a mile away from the last person who had looked at him and spoken to him as if he mattered, even if that mattered came tangled with possession. Evelyn's tenderness had been poisonous, but it had also been real enough to hurt when removed. That is the trap of intimacy under slavery. It can contain genuine feeling and still function as a chain. When you break the chain, you also break the feeling. You don't get to separate them cleanly. Somewhere on the road in late April 1860, Amos realized the full meaning of what Caldwell had done. Caldwell did not only hunt him physically. Caldwell had taught the nation to treat Amos as unworthy of record. That meant Amos could not rely on the normal human anchors, friends who could vouch, employers who could hire, neighbors who could testify. Any stability he built could be ripped away by a single accusation. The senator's power had turned the entire country into an extension of his reach. That is how political violence works at its highest level. It deputizes strangers. So Amos adopted a new identity that was less a name than a method. He became careful. He became quiet. He became disciplined about his own emotions, because emotions make people seek contact, and contact leaves trace. He avoided telling stories about his past because stories create specificity, and specificity creates a map back to you. He learned to answer questions with neutral facts and to never volunteer detail. He learned the survival art of giving people nothing to remember. This is the cruelty that doesn't show in official histories. We get taught about chains and auctions and whips because those are dramatic and undeniable. But there is another chain, the forced disappearance of your personal continuity. When the state erases your papers and your name, it pushes you into a life where the safest version of yourself is the least distinct. That is an assault on the soul disguised as order. Meanwhile, what happened to Evelyn? She returned to her father's orbit with her face composed and her conscience bleeding. She had done what she promised. She erased the trail. She burned the link. She cut Amos out of the records she could touch. She didn't free him by law. She couldn't without detonating her world. She freed him by sabotage, by making the hunt less efficient, by buying him time. And then she protected her father's empire by keeping the rescue unspoken. She became, in effect, an accomplice to silence even as she interfered with violence. Do not mistake that for redemption. It is a compromise shaped by power. She chose Amos over her father in one narrow lane, and then she chose her own survival in every other lane. That is not unusual. That is how privileged people often behave when their morality collides with their inheritance. They help quietly, then return to the comforts built on the harm. Amos crossed out of the senator's immediate range, but he did not cross into peace. The ending is not freedom, not in any clean sense. The ending is escape into a life that must remain unrecorded to remain possible. In April 1860, he became what the state had tried to manufacture. A man with no stable documents, no recognized name, no public existence. The difference is that now it was a choice enforced by necessity rather than a sentence imposed openly. That distinction matters because it reveals something prosecutorial about the nation. It forced its victim to participate in the cover-up, and that is the last indictment. Senator Caldwell Vance planned to incite unrest and push the country toward war, and when one enslaved man overheard him, the senator didn't debate him, he deleted him. The system allowed it because it was built for it. The daughter, Evelyn, performed a private rescue that required a private burial of the truth. Amos survived, but only by erasing the last personal evidence that he had once been seen and loved. So remember April 1860, not as a triumphant escape, as a warning label. When a nation treats paperwork as personhood, the powerful can kill you without touching you. And when survival requires you to erase your own heart, that is not mercy. That is the final tax the system collects. Final note for the file, and for anyone listening. If you're listening from somewhere, comment where you're from, city or country. Subscribe if you want the next dossier. And leave your theory, but keep it sharp. Did Evelyn save Amos because she loved him? Because she feared her father? Or because she realized too late that belonging was just another word for disappearance?